Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on fire dragons and their associated Phoenix Lord Fuegan. And I just need to start by saying it's utterly bizarre that it's taken me this long to make this particular video. I've talked about these units a lot, but they definitely deserve their own unit focus video for the simple reason that they are probably the single most powerful auto-include beat stick available to Eldari players. And so I kind of feel like I owe it, especially to newer players, to have a dedicated video about this, even if I've talked about this content plenty in other videos. I will have some details maybe that I haven't covered before. So we'll dive in. In these unit focus videos, I talk about what the unit is, its role on the table, obstacles to using them effectively, and how best to play around those obstacles. And I usually start by saying how competitive I think the unit is. This is an incredibly competitive unit. In fact, I would go so far as to say that fire dragons, especially a large unit of fire dragons, is probably the single most deadly hard target elimination tool maybe in all of 40k, like standalone hard target elimination tool. They're just incredibly powerful. It's certainly, I think, true at close to medium range, where you're not in melee, but you're pretty close. And in multiple Eldari detachments, they have access to stratagems that allows them to engage in tricky combos that make them more survivable than the majority of Eldari models. And so it's the combination of being able to lean into tricky tricks for survivability as well as just absolute insane damage output that renders fire dragons arguably our most non-negotiable tool. Can you have lists without them, especially if you're running, I don't know, Wind Rider host or Guardian Battle host or something? Yes, you can. They exist, but those are outlier lists. So their role on the table, what do? They kill hard targets and monsters. Tanks and monsters, they just absolutely obliterate them. That's their job. That's the thing that they do. They can multi-class into killing heavy infantry relatively effectively. And if you have the Phoenix Lord leading them, not only are they way better at that, but he also has this like weird survivability objective control trick that can be like a secondary function. And I think it's also worth noting that because Eldari are so fragile, so unbelievably fragile on the table, but so fast, they win games. Space Elves win games predominantly by taking away most of our opponent's tools relatively early on so that we can score big in the later part of the game, especially on primaries, because we really struggle to score primaries on turn 2. Often, all we're really doing on turn 2 is scoring a few primary points and making sure that our opponent doesn't max them out. So the incredibly fast and efficient target elimination power offered by fire dragons is often an important tool to realizing that early smackdown that Space Elves rely on to win games. So we're going to start by taking a look at the Fire Dragon unit card. We'll talk about why it's so good. There are a couple of different ways to build Fire Dragons out. There's a question as to whether you run 5 or 10, what weapon you give the Exarch, whether you do or don't use the Phoenix Lord, and arguably most importantly, whether you mount them in a transport. All of these decisions affect the cost. I will talk about the merits and drawbacks of several of them, but I'll just start by saying there are no bad choices except giving the Exarch the Dragon X Infusion Pistol. Other than that, there are no bad choices, but there are some choices that are probably more efficient. And I'll also talk about how fire dragons interact with some particular stratagems and detachment abilities that you may find yourself leaning into, and how you can use their aspect shrine token most effectively. They're a relatively simple unit in some respects, but there are a lot of interesting combos and tricks. So here we go. Fire dragons have the standard aspect warrior stat line: a 7-inch move, toughness 3, strength. I'm sorry, a 3-up save. They've got the heavy armor, 1 wound except to the Exarch, the 6-up leadership, the 10C, and they've got the 5-up invulnerable save. And then they're running around with a dragon fusion gun as a default weapon, and it's an assault weapon, so they can advance and still fire, and it has melt to 3, which means at half range, it's doing an additional 3 damage. It has 1 attack. It hits on 3s, strength 9, minus 4 AP, d6 damage. But if you're within 6 inches, it does d6 plus 3. And you might be thinking, Brent, that's good, but there are lots of Melta type weapons like that in the game. What makes these fire elves so special? And what makes these fire elves so special, in addition to some stratagem options, is the assured destruction ability. Each aspect shrine has a special ability, and the Fire Dragon one is just insane. In your shooting phase, each time a model in this unit makes a ranged attack that targets a monster or vehicle, you can reroll the hit roll, you can reroll the wound roll, and you can reroll the damage roll. So 5 fire dragons can jump out 3 inches out of a transport to within 6 inches of a tank or a monster, and the transport can be totally out of line of sight behind terrain. And then they're putting out 5 shots, hitting on 3s but rerolling all the misses, probably against something really tough, wounding on 5s but rerolling all the failed wounds, which ends up being a whole lot like wounding on 4s, maybe even slightly better. And then when you push through damage, you can reroll the wound roll. So if you roll a 1 or a 2 and you only do 5 damage, you re-roll it. And the Exarch has a better gun. You can either give the Exarch the Exarch Dragon Fusion gun, which is like the normal Dragon Fusion gun, but it's Melta 6, so it does D6 plus 6, which is just hilarious. Or the Fire Pike, which is strength 12 instead of 9, and range 18, but is also the D6 plus 3. Both these picks are really good. I personally like to, if my Fire Dragons are running without the Phoenix Lord, I like to have the Exarch running with the Fire Pike, because the additional range makes it easier to get the Melta damage, at least on the squad leader, if you can't get Melta damage with the whole squad for whatever reason. And then the strength 12 with the full rerolls means that it's generally going to wound on either a 4 or a 3, and being able to reroll is super helpful. But the advantage to the fusion gun is that with the Melta plus 6 is that it can make especially good use of the Aspect Shrine token. The way Aspect Shrine tokens work for all of the infantry aspects is that once per battle for each Aspect Shrine token that you have, and you get 1 per 5 models in the unit, you can change the result of 1 hit roll, 1 wound roll to a 6. So you can always, if you fail to wound with the fusion gun that does D6 plus 6 on the Exarch, you can always just go back in and change that die if you need to, which is why I feel like the Fire Pike is maybe not quite as essential if you're not trying to get the extra range with it. So then you're guaranteeing that you do that you wound, and if you're not up against an invuln, you're generally guaranteeing that you're doing D6 plus 6, and you can reroll that, and that's crazy. Also, they have the grenade stratagem, so if you want, before you do anything, you can throw a grenade at your target or a nearby target and roll 6 dice, and for each 4 up, you do a mortal wound. 5 dragons rolling at 120 points after having their points increased, I think, twice this edition. I think it's twice since the Codex. 120 points is entirely fair. They're so good. They were wildly undercosted before. And you very well may want to run 10 at 240 points. I usually do, especially if you're going to add the Phoenix Lord to the squad. I think it's tempting to run 10. But one of the big advantages to 10 is that they can often pretty reliably eliminate 2 targets, heavy, like hard targets in the middle of the table. Because what you do, because now you have 2 Aspect Shrine tokens, you can have the Exarch and like one dude throw a grenade at a nearby target and then blast the target, or 2 dudes, knowing that you're going to, if you need to, use an Aspect Shrine token to change the outcome of the Exarch's dice. So if there's no invuln on that target, you're definitely pushing through like D6 plus 6 damage and re-rolling it on top of the probably 3 mortal wounds you already did to it. And then you have another Fire Dragon or 2 in there just in case, and that'll often blow up a tank or kill a monster. And then the other 6 or 7 dragons shooting some other target with Melta probably can take that one out too. And then in both Warhost and Aspect Host, there's a way to get the whole squad back into a transport out of line of sight, totally safe before your opponent has a chance to do anything. And that's what the Skyborn Sanctuary stratagem, which allows a unit to do just that, to jump back in a transport within 6 inches at the end of the fight phase. But then there are a couple of other fun notes here. For example, if you're running Aspect Host, the detachment ability also gives you the opportunity to either reroll ones to hit or ones to wound, which obviously doesn't matter for fire dragons into hard targets because they reroll everything anyway. But it does matter once you've eliminated all of the hard targets in the middle of the table if you're using them to kill things like Terminators or just Space Marines, heavy infantry. Those rerolls help. But even more helpful are some stratagems that can set up some additional damage output. Preternatural Precision is a really nice one in Aspect Host. You spend a CP and you can give the whole squad sustained hits 1, ignores cover, or lethal hits. I think and if you spend an aspect token, you can give them 2 of these. I think generally the move is to not spend the aspect token, give the whole squad sustained hits. So not only are they rerolling misses, but 6s to hit or scoring 2 hits. And you can, if you're doing the thing where you're splitting fire to try to destroy 2 targets at once with the squad, you can, if you don't roll a 6 on 2 tries for the Exarch, you can use an Aspect Shrine token to set the roll to a 6 to automatically score sustained hits with it and still have a Shrine token left and a big squad if you need to then push through a hit. So this can be a fun trick for increasing the damage output of the squad such that they can pretty reliably blow up 2 tanks or kill a tank and a monster in the same shooting phase, generally around the middle of the table. But you will sometimes use them on a flank. The other stratagem that can sometimes be really useful is an Aspect Host for these guys is Warrior Focus. Until the end of the phase, each time a model in your unit makes an attack, you ignore any and all modifiers to the ballistic skill, weapon skill, strength, armor penetration, damage characteristic, and any or all modifiers to the hit roll. This is really big. Every now and then you come up against some enemy model with really good damage reduction. This is the biggest place you want to use it. It's something that halves incoming damage like the Avatar does. And if you can shut down having incoming damage, you can often pretty efficiently kill a model that otherwise can be annoyingly sticky. That Space Wolf legendary Dreadnought Bjorn, for example, is ever so much easier to get rid of when you can just shut down damage reduction. This is one that in most games you don't need, but when you need it, oh my goodness, does it leave your opponent slack-jawed and despairing, and does it make a big difference? It really does. And then in Warhost, the Blitzing Firepower stratagem also gives you sustained hits 1 within 12 inches, so always within range for your fire dragons. And then you use the same trick as before where you can use it to guarantee that you roll, if you don't naturally roll, if you don't naturally with the reroll roll into sustained on the Exarch, you can fish for it and then automatically just get a 6, change the die roll. And in a big squad, still be sitting on 1 aspect token if you then need to fudge the wound roll. And again, I think usually you don't need to spend a CP on getting sustained hits with the dragons. It's when you are being greedy and trying to blow up 2 targets that this can give you a little extra surety that can be useful. And sometimes you may have to decide, like, what is statistically better? I can only spend 1 CP. On my fire dragons, I could either throw the grenade or I could get sustained hits with the whole squad. And in that situation, I think it really just depends on what you're targeting. If the thing that you're targeting has a pretty good invuln save, maybe you throw the grenade. But otherwise, if you can push through even 1 more hit, you're going to do more damage with a fusion gun than you are with a grenade almost all of the time. And I've already mentioned Skyborn Sanctuary, which lets you jump back in a transport. So fire dragons can end up getting a little bit CP intensive if you are jumping back in a transport each turn. I generally find I don't do this more than twice, but if I jump back in a transport twice, that's 2 CP. That's not cheap. And then it might be hard to find other CP for things like grenades and getting those sustained hits, or maybe you want sustained hits elsewhere on the table on your Reapers or something. And for this reason, you could have the Fire Dragons led by an Autarch rather than the Phoenix Lord, who, in addition to bringing another fusion gun, also lets them use a stratagem, lets a squad use a stratagem for -1 CP each turn. And pretty much every turn, Fire Dragons want to use a stratagem, so having the Autarch in there ends up being a little bit like having Eldred. It basically amounts to additional CP each turn the Fire Dragons are alive. And then he also can come with a Starglaive, so they can multi-class into being a melee unit in the late game if you need them to. But for another 35 points, you could get the Phoenix Lord Fuegan, and that's generally what people decide they want to do if they're going to have a leader. Fuegan does a couple things for the squad. One, he brings his own incredibly souped up fusion weapon, the Seer Song, the lance attack for which basically has the best aspects of both the Fire Pike and the Exarch fusion gun, but they're a little bit better. So it has an 18-inch range. It hits on 2s instead of 3s. It's strength 14. It's got the -4 AP and the Melta 6, so it does D6 plus 6. But then in addition, it's actually better than range 18 because Fuegan gives the entire squad an additional 6 inches of range on their Melta weapons, which means all of the fusion guns your Fire Dragons are carrying, instead of having a range of 12, have a range of 18, and they get Melta at 9 instead of Melta at 6, which is kind of a big deal. Also, because he's part of the squad, you can now use the Aspect Shrine token on Fuegan if you need to. So instead of guaranteeing that the Exarch's souped up weapon wounds, in the event that you don't wound with Fuegan's weapon, you could wound with that one. Although it's worth pointing out that they have the same AP and the same damage output when you're targeting a hard target. So maybe that doesn't really matter, but you get another super souped up weapon that does D6 plus 6 damage. And once Fuegan's in the squad, you can pretty reliably kill 2 pretty tough things unless they have good invulns without spending CP to get sustained hits, or probably without throwing a grenade. Now, Fuegan also does a couple of other things for you. He brings some melee credibility to the squad in the same way that the Autarch does. The Autarch Starglaive has 4 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 6, -3/3, which is pretty good, and that flat 3 damage is really nice. So sometimes in the late game, after the first couple turns, your opponent doesn't really have any tanks or monsters left just because of how Eldari play. And so now, if your opponent is approaching the middle of the board with a unit of Terminators or some other kind of heavy infantry, the ability to shoot that thing and then charge in with a leader with a melee weapon that's got good AP that does flat 3 damage is no joke. It can be the difference between the Fire Dragons like picking up a couple of Terminators and a 5 Marine squad versus just like wiping the squad. And Fuegan does that for you too, because in addition to the Seer Song, he's got the Fire Axe, which is solidly better than that Starglaive. It's 6 attacks instead of 4, also hitting on 2s. Strength 5 instead of strength 6, -4 AP though instead of -3, and also flat 3 damage. So it's basically, it's roughly half again the damage output of the Autarch's version of the weapon. So the additional 35 points for Fuegan is giving you a much better shooting weapon, a much better melee weapon, and also some additional durability we'll talk about in a moment. And he soups up the whole squad with the additional range for the Melta. He is the better pick. He really is. The only time I've ever also run the Autarch is when I've experimented with lots of Fire Dragons, and I have like Fuegan leading 10 and maybe the Autarch also leading some. It is possible in Warhost because there are 2 stratagems in Warhost that can potentially let you get back into transport. Feigned Retreat can also let you do it, because if you just... I'm sorry, not Feigned Retreat. That's the one that lets you fall back from combat. Fire and Fade. It lets you make a normal move of D6 plus 1. If you finish a normal move wholly within 3 inches of transport, you can just get into it. So if you're running Warhost, you can have 2 squads shoot and jump back in transports before your opponent's turn. And maybe you would want that second squad to also be fire dragons. Although I am generally a one big squad of fire dragons autarch at this point, but there's nothing wrong with the other build. And having the autarch allow you to use the stratagem for free can make it possible to have enough CP to be jumping back in with both units. And so maybe you would experiment with having two serpents or two wave serpents, one with like 10 and the Phoenix Lord and one with 5 in the autarch and some other unit. Although I would suggest just having the big squad probably with the Phoenix Lord and the wave serpent and calling it good and spending your other points on other stuff. Because if you're careful with this, it's pretty hard to effectively and efficiently counter it without losing some stuff. Your opponent's going to have to trade some stuff. Now, here's the other thing that Fuegan does for you. In addition to adding the extra killiness, giving making the whole squad more killy with the additional Melta range and being able to multi-class into melee. In addition, Fuegan himself is weirdly good at holding objectives, especially in the late game, because he's harder to kill than any other Phoenix Lord, rather substantially. He's got the standard Phoenix Lord stat line with the 7-inch move and the toughness 3 and the 2-up save, but the 4-up invuln with 5 wounds. However, he has the unquenchable resolve ability. The first time this model is destroyed at the end of the phase, roll 1d6, and on a 2-up, he gets back up as close as possible to where he was destroyed with not with an engagement range, with full wounds. So he takes 5 damage, he dies, and he just gets back up. And it's, for you newer players, the fact that this happens at the end of phase is important because it means that your opponent can't like shoot him to death, let him stand back up, and then shoot him to death again in the same phase. The only way to kill Fuegan in one turn is to kill him in the shooting phase, charge him, and then kill him again in melee. And most opponents are not in a position to do that. So if you have him on an objective in the middle of the board that you really need to score late in the game, it guarantees that you're going to be able to score that objective when you really need to. Well, it doesn't guarantee it. You could roll a 1, he could die, not stand back up, and there's no way to re-roll that. Command re-rolls don't apply there. So it's not certain, but it's certainly likely, and it's a powerful tool. Now, before I move on to talking about how I think you want to go about deploying these and playing them in the majority of your games, I will just point out that even if you're not running Warhost or Aspect Host, in Warhost or Aspect Host, I think you're just crazy not to take a huge squad of dragons. In some of the other detachments, they still have the full rerolls. They're still a really useful tool. But in some of the other detachments, there's some other trick. They can always get back in a transport using fade back, the agile maneuver. If an opponent shoots the squad and they make that fade back normal move for a battle focus token and they finish near a transport, they can just get back in. You can, because it is a normal move. When you finish a normal move within 3 inches of a transport, you can get back in. But they may take some casualties doing it that way. And if you're running Seer Council, there's the Unshrouded Truth ability, that stratagem that lets you just teleport a unit. Basically deep strike a unit that you already have on the board, teleport it to just outside of 9 inches of the enemy. This can be a useful tool for getting fire dragons into position. The only issue is that even if you've got the extended Melta range to 9, you're not going to be close enough for Melta. But the fact that you're rerolling the hit roll, rerolling the damage roll, and rerolling the wound roll, I did that out of order, means that even without the Melta damage against a single target, this is probably fine. They're never bad. Even in like jet bike lists, like dragons are good. They're always good. They don't need the strats and Aspect Host and War Host to make them terrifying target elimination tools that are reasonably pointed for what they can do. It's just they're especially good in those detachments, which are also probably the most popular detachments in the book since Ynnari got the big nerf. But they're good in Ynnari too. Okay, so playing them, deploying them. Generally speaking, you want to start them in a transport, and you want that transport to be a wave serpent. Falcons don't do anything for them. The fire support ability on a Falcon, they're already re-rolling everything. They don't need the wound re-rolls. I guess it would matter if they were targeting infantry, but that's not going to happen a lot, or beasts. So you're going to start them in a wave serpent. You can use vectored engines on the wave serpent, which is the agile maneuver that star engines, which is the agile maneuver that lets you make a super advance with a vehicle and still count it as a normal move. So it would move 14 plus D6 plus 1, and if you're doing it in Warhost, it ends up being D6 plus 2 because of the detachment roll. And that's just a crazy threat range for the dragons, who could, if you needed them to, that same turn, jump out 3 inches from the transport. So, but probably on turn 1, all you're doing with this is, if you get first turn, you're moving the transport into the midfield, totally out of line of sight of the opponent, and having access to the agile maneuver for the engines is just a little extra movement to help you get the transport where it really needs to be, safely out of line of sight. And if your opponent took first turn and your opponent knows what dragons can do and sees the transport, probably they're not going to create a situation where you have the opportunity to just zip out with the transport, jump with the engine, the extra engine movement, jump out 3 inches from the transport and just totally blast something and jump back in. But maybe they'll let you. And if so, go for it. But generally speaking, if your opponent plays more conservatively, or if you get first turn, you're going to position the transport just out of line of sight in the midfield. And you generally want to deploy them relatively late when you're doing your drops initially, because obviously you want the dragons to be more or less across the table from whatever the targets are that you're going to most need them to eliminate. So some big dreadnought, some big monster, a couple of vehicles that are going to push into the midfield. Dragons are a tool that are going to prevent your opponent's big ass kickers from bearing down on the midfield and dominating your fragile elves and keeping them from playing the middle of the table and being able to score primaries at all. Like dragons, anything your opponent moves into the middle of the table, theoretically the dragons can just pick up anything big that your opponent tries to move into the middle of the table. So you want to position them to do that in a place where they can jump 3 inches out of the transport, make their 7-inch move, or they could advance, or they could use agile maneuvers, or both to go even further, right? You could essentially have a move characteristic of 9 if you use swift as the wind, and advance if you need to, because the fusion guns are all assault weapons in order to get into melta range. So generally this means if you can get the transport sort of in the middle of the table, the dragons are in a position where they can play the middle of the table on your next turn, or they can jump out and move far enough to play one of the flanks on a lot of maps. Not on all maps, but on a lot of maps. So they end up with this crazy threat range, and you can then move the transport after they've jumped out such that they can jump back into it using a stratagem. Now, ideally, especially in the early game when your opponent probably still has a lot of guns that can blow your transports up, you want to try to keep the transport out of line of sight while doing this, and this is kind of the important finesse move. So because dragons are infantry, of course, when they jump out of the transport, they can move straight through a ruin. So ideally, you keep the transport behind a ruin with the obscuring keyword. You jump the dragons out of it, or you move them out of it such that they're in the ruin. They can see the target. They've got melta range, maybe with some help from the Phoenix Lord. They blow the thing up, and then when they use the stratagem, they jump back into the tank, which is totally out of line of sight. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, one thing your dragons will die to is Overwatch. If your opponent has any torrent weapons, heavy flamers, silly Tau stuff I don't know the name of, I don't know, any torrent weapons at all, or they just have sufficient volume of fire that it doesn't matter that they're only hitting on 6s, right? If they're rolling 20 dice with sustained hits or something, Then you have to be really mindful of Overwatch, in which case you may want to use Flitting Shadows, the agile maneuver that lets you shut down Overwatch every time you make a move with your dragon's new autarchs. You young elf enthusiasts, stop and ask yourself, do I need to use Flitting Shadows? Is there something that's simply going to Overwatch me and automatically hit? Or with Crazy Volume of Fire that's going to kill a bunch of my elves? Because every time you lose a dragon, it significantly reduces the damage output of the squad. They're all so powerful that you really can't afford to, especially if you're running a small squad, you really can't afford to lose them. If you have 10 and you lose a couple, it's not a big deal, but you don't want to lose them to Overwatch. And for this reason, sometimes there's tension between dragons and some other units in your list. I find there's often tension between my dragons and my banshees. They're both great. They're both in all of my most competitive lists. But banshees often want to finish a move close enough to charge some unit, and they don't want to be overwatched. Dragons don't want to be overwatched. And sometimes you have to make a hard choice about which squad is going to be subject to Overwatch. But usually your opponent only has really dangerous shooting, really dangerous Overwatch in one spot on the table, in which case often you just pick the squad that's more vulnerable to the torrent weapons or the volume of fire or whatever, and you don't worry about your opponent shooting at your banshees with 10 bolter shots with no AP that only hit on 6s or something. I know there's a bunch of bolter shots with -1 AP, and you just accept that you're likely going to lose a banshee, or you're likely going to lose a dragon if you've got 10 in the squad. But be mindful. Make it a choice. Don't get caught flat-footed. Now, the other nice thing about keeping the transport nearby the dragons and being able to jump them back in is with their extremely limited range, they're only playing the part of the table they're immediately in. So you can, if you need to, counter your opponent in the middle of the table, jump them back into the transport, but then go hunting. On your next turn, make the move with Star Engines, so the Wave Serpent's going 14 plus D6 plus 1 or 14 plus D6 plus 2 in Warhost, and then the dragons are jumping out 3 inches to target something else that's maybe not committing deep. And if you've done enough damage to your opponent's list, you might be able to afford having the transport out in the open at this point while the dragons jump out, shoot the thing, and then get back in at the end of the fight phase or whatever. But the transport's not just there to keep them alive. It's also there to allow them to reposition aggressively. Often, though, this ends up being a win more move. If your opponent is no longer capable of contesting the middle of the table, you've probably won. But sometimes not. Sometimes like you have other stuff that can play the middle of the table, and there's somewhere else where you need your dragons. The other nice thing about having both the transport and the dragons with the grenades, there are times into stuff with really good invulns where you might have the dragons throw a grenade for an average of 3 mortal wounds before they shoot with their guns. And then if you need to, you can charge with the Wave Serpent and use Vehicle Shock to do another average of another 3 mortal wounds. So between the dragons and the transport, if you have the CP, you can put 6 mortal wounds on something in addition to all of the shooting. And especially if you're trying to be greedy into multiple targets, this can be super useful. And sometimes when you get into the late game and there's not a lot left on the table, not a lot of either your opponent's stuff or your stuff, maybe the entire squad of dragons gets wiped out, but you have Fuegan just stand up on an objective, and your partially messed up Wave Serpent that your opponent doesn't want to bother killing once they're no longer dragons to move around jumps on another objective, and Fuegan's still an ass kicker, and the Wave Serpent can still Vehicle Shock stuff. And this can just be a really useful tool, even in the late game once all of your opponent's powerful stuff is dead. Or hard targets that you have the fire dragons for killing. Even once all that stuff is dead, this is still really good. Now, to be fair, the Phoenix Lord, 10 fire dragons, and a Wave Serpent is 465 points. So it's like 25% of your list. But my goodness, is that almost 25% of your list well spent? And you don't absolutely need the Phoenix Lord. You can save yourself 120 points by leaving him at home. That would get you 5 more fire dragons, but 5 more fire dragons won't fit in that same transport and can't jump back in for that 1 CP. He can, and I really don't think you'll ever be sorry you brought him if you decide to include him. Okay, last note before I wrap this one up. Do be a little bit careful when you position your transport of enemy infantry that can really tear up vehicles. There's some pretty powerful melee units in Warhammer 40k that are kind of good into anything. Stuff like Gene Stealers led by a Brood Lord have tricks for just putting out wild numbers of devastating wounds. Orcs have some units like this. There's some incredibly powerful infantry units that can run through a wall and blow away a wave serpent. And so just be careful. Another thing that you can do, the thing that I often do, is if you do have the wave serpent just out of line of sight behind obscuring terrain in the midfield, have a small unit of banshees just in front of it. So any opponent trying to run through the ruin to get into melee will have to hit the banshees first, and banshees fight first. So your banshees will kill whatever's trying to get through the ruin to get to your transport with your fire dragons in it. And also just know how far your opponent's stuff can move, so you know whether your opponent can move and get a bead on the transport that you're hiding, and then you're just playing the odds a little bit about whether or not they really have the shooting to blow up the transport or not. And that, my elf friends, is what I've got. The majority of this, certainly the basics of this, the majority of this I probably have hit on in other videos at other times. So I'm sorry to those of you who watch all of my content very carefully, some of it twice, and remember everything, but I do think you're a minority. And I also think I got a couple things in here that maybe I haven't mentioned before. And for you newer players that are trying to figure out elves for the first time, if you don't already own a Wave Serpent and 10 Fire Dragons, buy them. They should be your next ads. If I were currently making your first 1K video thing that I made, I'm still happy with most of the content in that your first 1K video, except that I definitely think the first thing you buy is 10 Fire Dragons, a transport, and maybe also the Phoenix Lord. Like all Space Elf stuff, getting the positioning right and the timing can be a little bit finicky, but this is a very powerful, very satisfying tool that even if you're not making maximum use of your Fire Dragons with every little trick and every positioning nuance, they're still probably going to do good work for you. They're still probably going to earn their points before they get picked up. And that's what I've got. If you have your own ideas about how to most effectively use Bernie Fire Elves in 40K, please leave those in the comments below. If you have not subscribed, I hope you'll subscribe. If you just want to leave a comment to help the algorithm or to be friendly, please do so. And if anybody's interested in discussing this more with a community of like-minded elf enthusiasts, you could, for $3 a month, become a patron. I will link my Patreon in the video description. Back again soon with something new. Until then, best of luck with the hottest elves this side of the Eye of Terror. Bye.